Today we're going to talk about systems and conflict in the church.
What I want to talk to you about today are some of the most helpful principles that I have ever found as a pastor. In fact, I wished I had been taught this in seminary, but I wasn't. I had to read up on it later. What I want to talk to you about is systems theory. What that means is this: that not all the problems that you're going to encounter in the church are theological problems, and they don't all have to do directly with sin. A lot of them are caused by anxiety. They're caused by the fear that we have, the natural fear we have of resistance to change. They simply have to do with people not understanding how to do and why they should have good, solid relationships between each other. Sometimes you'll find a church that's sincerely interested in seeking the Lord together, where most of the people are truly saved and converted, and yet they behave in ways that are destructive to each other, destructive to pastors, and destructive to strangers. And for some reason that is hard to understand, they're being torn apart. And what's tearing them apart is anxiety. When our defensiveness and our anxiety levels get high, then the church becomes dysfunctional. Systems theory was developed for family counseling by Bowen and others to try to explain how families work. Other people, such as Rabbi Friedman in Generation to Generation and Richardson in the book that's referred to in my notes, have taken that and applied it very effectively to the way churches respond to each other. If you want to read more about that, I highly recommend that you get the books that are referred to in the notes. But what I'm giving you today are just the highlights of systems theory. I promise you these insights, if you take them to heart, can be enormously helpful and enormously effective in being able to understand how churches work and how you can lead a church through conflict and crisis.
The first thing we want to do is describe what a system is. A system is a balanced group of people, an organized group of people in a particular relationship. What one person does affects everybody else in that relationship. A good example of a system would be a family. There are some rules that govern the relationships between people in a system. The first rule is called homeostasis. Homeostasis simply means the tendency of all systems to maintain its own structure against change. Once a system has been established and a particular relationship has been established, people like to keep it way. Another way of saying that is, we've always done it that way before. How many times have we heard that in churches? This isn't something that's specific to churches, but is true of any organized system. We just don't like to change them. Change in a system produces anxiety, and anxiety causes systems to break down. Now, in order to counteract that anxiety, we need non-anxious presences. A non-anxious presence is a person who can face anxiety, who can stand up to anxiety without appearing to be anxious about it. Actually, it's more than just appearance. You really have to be non-anxious. Discomfort is made bearable by a leader who is not upset by it. The pastor needs to be in the system of the church, the calming presence. As change comes, the pastor must not appear to be anxious or overly worried, but his peace, his demeanor that he gets from God, helps everybody else to put up with the anxiety that is present in the system. Another principle that keeps us balanced within the anxiety that is produced by change is a concept of flexible balance or symmetry, which basically means this: that one part of the system necessitates changes in other parts of the system to maintain equilibrium. Think about it in terms of a marriage. If the husband is the one who works and the wife stays home to take care of the kids, then the balance is maintained. But if the wife goes back to work, then the husband must take over some of the responsibilities the wife did at home in order to maintain balance and to keep things ordered. There has to be a willingness to change the way we do things. The same thing is true in a church. When churches are upset by anxiety, we have to be willing to change. If we become inflexible and fight against change, then there's more likelihood that anxiety will tear us apart. Another thing that causes a negative impact upon anxiety in a church are what are called overfunctioners. Overfunctioners upset the balance of a system by doing everybody else's job in the system. Think about it in terms of a volleyball team. In a volleyball team, there's always one hotshot who wants to run all over the field and play all the parts. That leaves it possible for everybody else not to respond when the ball comes over, as eventually everybody else sits back and lets the overfunctioner do it. And meanwhile, he is not able to cover it well. The same thing happens in a church. When one person in the church is doing all the work in the church or too much work in the church, then it causes everybody else to sit back and do nothing. And this response causes the anxiety to increase in a church. Eventually, the overfunctioner gets tired, and everybody else gets lazy. Overfunctioners really can upset the balance and cause greater anxiety within the church. Another factor that causes systems to break down are secrets. Somebody has said that secrets are to systems what plaque are to arteries. In order for a system to be able to adjust to change, there has to be a free flow of information through the system so that we can know how to adjust and to what to adjust to. Secrets block that free information so that only parts of information get out, and the result of that is bad adjustment to change. This causes more pressure and can cause a breakdown in the system. Another factor that causes anxiety to increase in a system such as a church are what are called emotional triangles. Emotional triangles are places where secrets have caused people not to speak to one another. The result of that, they become the most common way of avoiding dealing with an emotional problem by expecting somebody else to do it. For example, someone comes to the pastor and says, "Pastor, would you go talk to somebody else in the church for me because I can't talk to them?" As a result, the pastor becomes involved in their personal problems and disputes. The result of that is that the person no longer has the opportunity to talk to each other. Here's what that looks like. Here is the person who comes to you. They see themselves as the victim. The villain in the emotional triangle is the person who they are complaining about. They cannot speak to each other, so they go to the hero, who is often the pastor, and they ask the pastor to intervene on their behalf. As a result of that, of course, no communication goes on between the so-called victim and the so-called villain. That in fact, they wind up being farther apart than ever. And pretty soon the villain, seeing themselves as the victim, also comes to the pastor to complain about the same thing. In such a system, nothing ever really is resolved. And the pastor is used as the scapegoat if things go wrong. Another kind of triangle happens when an issue is presented as a false issue between people. For example, person one and person two are having personal disputes. Those personal disputes are their true issue, but they can't talk about their personal disputes, so they come up with a false issue. It could be theological, it could be a matter of the drapery in the church. That issue becomes the conflict between them. And instead of talking about the true issue that is between the two of them, they will talk about their disagreements over the draperies of the church or over free will and predestination. And they begin to get to display unusual anger and unusual sensitivity about things that are not all that important. As a result of this, of course, no real dealing of the disputes go on. And in this way, disputes can be carried on for years and years in the church because they never really deal with the true issues at hand. In a system full of emotional triangles, conflict is looked at like bolts of lightning that destroy everybody they touch. As a result, usually in such a system, they produce a system of lightning rods. Now, lightning rods are individuals who are expected to be able to deal with the issues at hand. Now, this becomes another way of escaping the responsibility for individuals from dealing with their own problems. Lightning rods look like this. Here is the pastor. The lightning rod comes to the pastor, who is usually a trusted friend or elder, and he says, "Pastor, I've been hearing problems. There are all these complainers out there who've been talking to me, but they don't feel like they can talk to you, so I'm bringing the issue ahead to you." Now, to the complainers, this is a way of dealing with issues with the pastor without actually talking to the pastor. As a result, the lightning rod enables these people to continue to have their issues, but never really brings it to the place where they have to deal with the relationships to the pastor. Lightning rods become a way of avoiding conflict and therefore increasing, not decreasing, anxiety within the church. Another way of dealing with responsibility badly is what's called scapegoats. The scapegoat in the Old Testament was a sacrificial animal in which the sins of Israel were set over them, and then they were sent off into the wilderness. Scapegoats in the church are people who are used in that exact same way. They are sacrificial people who are expected to take the blame for all the problems to keep the systems away from change. Oftentimes in the church, this becomes an associate pastor or a youth pastor, or sometimes the pastor himself is treated as a scapegoat. All the problems of the church are blamed on those people, and they believe if they get rid of them, they will get rid of everyone. Sometimes it is a layperson who may have problems, who is blamed for all the problems, and we can say if they just get rid of that person, then our problems will be solved. This, of course, never happens. It makes them feel better for a short time, but the same patterns show up the next time they hire a youth director or the next time they hire an associate pastor or even a pastor. Another pattern we see in a church which is dysfunctional is called the identified patient. This means that systemic problems manifest themselves at the weakest point of the system instead of where the problem really arises. So people who show issues are expected to be the problem children, and everybody else doesn't have to face their problems. Let me look at it another way. They say that a chain is weakest at its weakest link. But if you look at the chain, you realize the pressure is really not coming from the weakest link. That's just where it breaks. The real pressure is coming from the other sides. In a family, for example, we may have a child who is acting out, and everybody says the problem is with the child. In reality, the problem may be the parents. They may be getting a divorce. They may be having together. They may even be abusive. But the identified patient that everybody focuses on is a child who breaks. In the church, the same thing is the case. Oftentimes, the problems in the church are not where they appear to be, but with the people who are putting pressure on those who are breaking. So we need to look beyond the immediate identified patient if we're going to help solve problems in the church and see where the problems are really coming from. Another factor that helps us deal or hinders us from dealing with anxiety in the church is closeness versus distance. Whenever we're in an anxious situation, sometimes we have to get away from that situation, and we have to rest in order for us to be able to deal with it better. On the other hand, if we rest too long from that situation, if we get too far away, then that becomes a problem too. We become avoiders. So within a church, between people in the church, there is a various amount of intimacy. Sometimes we need to be very close so that we can deal with things. Other times we need to be away, and that is different for each person. But we all need to be differentiated from one another. We all need to be able to keep some distance, as we need to be able to keep distance from the problems at times. Too much distance and we have problems. Too little distance, we also have problems. But we all need to be self-differentiated. We need to be able to draw away from the whole and deal with things alone at times. Another characteristics we see in dysfunctional systems are what are called generational patterns. These are patterns that are passed down from one generation to another. In the church, we often see it in generations of leadership and elders. We see the same characters, the same roles being filled by different people over time. We see it in different pastorates. One pastor has problems, the next pastor winds up having exactly the same problems. This is what we call the church DNA. That when we do not deal with anxiety, the way we deal with anxiety is passed down from one generation to another. So in order to break generational patterns, it takes quite a bit of effort, because homeostasis says that we're going to go back to dealing with things in the same way that we learned from our parents and our parents' parents. So it takes a great deal of time and effort for us to change the generational patterns of a church. So how do we respond to that? How do we make people more open and less anxious in a time of change in a church? Well, the first thing that we need to do is to take changes slowly and safely. Let's not rush into them, because we know that the rushing is going to increase anxiety. But take things easily, one step at a time. Learn to measure the tolerance that your church has for change and build from that. Second, be a non-anxious presence. Notice I don't say act like a non-anxious presence. I say be a non-anxious presence. Your relationship to God needs to be strong enough to where you can cast your anxieties upon Him and actually have a sense of peace. Third, have a sense of humor. Humor diffuses a lot of difficult situations, and it helps people to get through things that make them uncomfortable. So learn to use your sense of humor. Learn to use play to be able to defuse anxiety. Encourage openness. The example of openness starts right from the pulpit. It starts right from the pastor. We need to learn to be open and vulnerable people and not hiding behind our pastoral fronts, but be real people, and it'll encourage them to be real too. Discourage triangles. Do not take third-party criticisms. Do not go with somebody or go for somebody to somebody else on their behalf and render a complaint. Make them go back. Tell them you'll go with them if you want to, but don't encourage third-party criticisms. And in emotional triangles that are built around issues, don't be suckered into think that everything is theological when a lot of times it's personal. Don't be a scapegoat. Don't accept the blame for problems that are not your own, but help people to look to see what the real problems are in the church, and not simply allow yourself to be scapegoated. Keep people informed. People are less anxious when they know what's going on, so don't hide things from the congregation. Encourage openness and honesty on all levels.
As I said, these are just the highlights of systems theory. Just remember this. Paul said, "Be anxious over nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication, make your needs be known before God." Be anxious over nothing is something that comes when we learn to trust Him in all things. Most people in the church have a great deal of problem trusting God. So because of that, they develop defenses and they develop poor, dysfunctional systems that make it harder for them to trust God. But by being a non-anxious presence and by learning to trust God ourselves in times of difficulty in the church, we can help them trust God as well. We can model before them what it means to be a trusting people by having flexibility, by being open, by being vulnerable, and by trusting God to protect us when things seem to get difficult.